Hello, Nintendo fans. This is Harman Smith with today's installment of Nintendeen Today. What does this little rat have to say for himself today? Let's find out.
Everybody, I got a quick one for you on this lovely Friday night. So this is just a very quick recap of many of the discussions that we had last year. Leading up to the launch of the Nintendo Switch 2 as well as through the first few months of its life, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not Nintendo would entirely shift their focus towards the Switch 2. Now, obviously many Nintendo fans strongly believe that Nintendo would basically completely abandon the Switch because it had been out for 7 or 8 years, and the belief in their mind was that there was really no point in waiting for the generation to continue. They believed that the shift would be pretty quick and pretty abrupt.
Rare Nintendeen W. This was a actual talking point among the community last year where they really did think that the Switch 1 was old, it was tired, it didn't have any momentum yet left. And yet in 2026, the best-selling game that they put out so far this year has been Tomodachi Life, a Switch 1 game. There are still Switch 1 games on the horizon, and it really just goes to show you just how out of touch the community actually is when it comes to Nintendo coverage, because it didn't make any sense to simply stop replacing the Switch 1 after the Switch 2 came out. This was a console that sold 155 million units. It has all this support, all these features that tie into Switch 2. Like, people are going to be using their Switch 1s for a long time. I myself still use mine.
This is of course largely because many people have been very critical about PlayStation and Xbox because they didn't fully make the shift over to their next console when they jumped from the Xbox One to the PS4 to the PS5 and the Series X. So I think there was a bit of a chip on the shoulder of Nintendo fans because in their minds, their idea was, no, Nintendo does things right and there's no need to remain with the Switch 1. It's time to move forward where all the new games are going to be. I spoke quite a bit about this last year, and one of my biggest arguments for not upgrading to the Switch 2 yet was that clearly many of the games were still going to be revolving around the Switch 1, whether they were Switch 2 edition titles, which filled in most of the last year, and also brand new titles that are effectively just Switch 1 titles that you also happen to be able to play on the Switch 2. Some of the best and most popular sellers of the last year fall under that second category. Mario Galaxy 2, for example, that's not a Switch 2 game. Tomodachi Life, that's not a Switch 2 game, and neither is Rhythm Heaven. Now, if you recall, back in November, after the quarterly financials from Nintendo, President Shuntaro Furukawa back then told investors that the company will shift its primary development focus to the Switch 2 moving forward. And that was considered a huge statement back then. Many people were immediately celebrating. A 5-month-old console, the fastest selling hardware in Nintendo's history, in gaming history, in addition to having the largest lineup in history. And Furukawa also remarked that the owners of the original Nintendo Switch have been uniformly migrating to the Nintendo Switch 2. This was back in November 4th, right after the launch of Pokemon Legends ZA, where they had a massive launch. Back when people were still counting month by month about how the Switch 2 was the fastest selling console in history. Now granted, they're still doing that, but back then it meant a lot more because you didn't have any negative headlines. People still didn't quite realize back then that the only reason it was the fastest selling console was because it was the only one with that many units available.
Hey, genius, you do realize that if people buy a Nintendo Switch 2, that counts as a sale, right? Is he really trying to argue that the Switch 1 or the Wii would have outpaced the Switch 2 sales if they had them in stock at launch? Okay, is he really trying to make this argument? Because I can assure you that's not true. You can clearly see by looking at software sales just how much higher the overall software sales are on the Switch 2 compared to older pieces of Nintendo hardware, right? The Switch 2 is dominating. It's doing really well, and no amount of coping and seething and saying it's because it's because they stocked it this time. That's not going to change the fact that people are buying this console
that early on. And of course, back when this news came out in November, that was considered a win for Switch 2. It was considered a win for Switch 2 fans even. It was a justification of the absurd amount of money that they just spent on overpriced hardware, and software for that matter. November 4th was just over half a year ago now, and seemingly a lot has changed in this last half a year. Amongst many other things, one of them is the fact that Nintendo had one of the slowest Novembers, Decembers, Januaries, and Februaries of the last decade.
This is not true, and I'm not sure why he's trying to convince people that it is. The real reason why the story came out that consoles were underperforming this holiday season was due to the rising prices of PlayStation and Xbox. Those consoles underperformed, those consoles didn't do very well, and the Switch 2 got lumped in with that. Alongside the Switch 1, which of course didn't sell as well now that the Switch 2 was out. Like, this was not a slow holiday season for Nintendo. They sold plenty of units in the first 6 months. Most hardcore fans picked it up in June or earlier than the holiday season, right? Most holidays, most console launches come out around November or around that period, which is why traditionally those holiday sales are stacked. In this case, the Switch 2 sales were stacked in the first couple of months with Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza, which still are the most popular exclusives on the platform. There was no big holiday game this year because there wasn't a need for one. Mario Kart World and Donkey Kong Bonanza like fulfilled that niche.
In fact, out of every major console launch in history, it actually had one of the worst Decembers when you account for the first December in a console's lifecycle when it's no longer supply constrained. Now, when they got to March, they got a good month. They got a pretty good month, actually, largely because of Pokemon Pokepia. The problem is the deficit was so large in all Western markets, from those November through February months, that even if you got a better March, it doesn't make up for a poor holiday season. Remember, a vast majority of console sales usually tend to come during that holiday season.
Yeah, because most consoles launch during the holiday season. Most major releases launch during the holiday season. This isn't really a confusing thing. Okay, the Switch 2 launched in June. It had an unusually good June, and by the holiday season, it had tapered off a little bit because everyone who really wanted one had one already. However, going into 2026, we're starting to see the releases like ramp up again, and we're gonna see like more and more games going into this holiday season. Yoshi, Splatoon, Raiders, Star Fox. Like Fire Emblem. Like, there's a lot of big things coming in the second half of the year. So you are gonna see a lot more Pokemon Pokepias in the very near future. Star Fox by itself has really incentivized a lot of console sales, and I'm very surprised that Nintendeen hasn't reported on that. Like, Star Fox by itself seems to be a massive driver of sales, and that's something that I think a lot of people didn't see coming. But it's very interesting that Nintendeen hasn't reported on that yet.
So just because you double your sales in March, it does not mean that you make up for half the sales that you should have gotten in the wintertime during Christmas. Effectively, because the holiday season was so slow, what ended up happening is all of those overshipments that were sent out during the holiday season, that's what ended up getting sold through January, February, and March. And this is a very big reason why so many people overestimated just how well the Switch 2 was doing leading up to the last financials. Right, like in the last week, if you've noticed, the negative headlines around Nintendo have continued.
Yeah, because the gaming journalism industry is entirely in PlayStation's pocket. Okay, this is not like a new thing. We've been seeing this happen for decades. The industry just rallies to destroy Nintendo while glazing PlayStation and Xbox. In pretty much every case I can think of, all of the negative headlines we've seen regarding Nintendo over the past year are completely fake. We saw people spurging out about the price hike last year. Didn't happen until later this year. Okay. We saw people spurging out about investors. The investors don't have any power. People have been spurging out about the release window when people have been spurging out about the games, about Nintendo Directs. Like, it doesn't really mean anything because at the end of the day, Nintendo has had an extremely, extraordinarily successful launch. And what we're seeing now is just the industry like coping and seething about it. So they can sell people on like mixtape instead.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think their stock market went down so much? Why do you think so many people were upset? So many people were disappointed? So many people expected more? Because most of the headlines all around the world were the expectation that the Switch 2 had reached and surpassed actually 20 million consoles sold. But as we all know, when you have so much extra inventory still sitting there from Christmas time, well, that's what ends up getting sold over the next few months, and that's what happened with the Switch 2. And that's why the amount of units that were actually sold out in Western markets, I think between the Americas and Europe, was just over 1 million consoles during that entire 3-month window. Roughly 750-ish to the Americas and roughly 300,000-ish to Europe. That is one of the slowest Q4s that Nintendo has ever had in Western markets, I think since the Wii U era. And even then you had the 3DS doing numbers. But hey, anybody that was focusing on the shipped versus sold and the sell-in versus the sell-through numbers like all of us were, we already know this stuff. It's the people that were just dancing around the headlines that didn't quite get what was happening. A lot has changed from that November quarterly until this most recent one that they just had right now. And seemingly, so has this idea of shifting towards the Nintendo Switch 2. Because now, you start to backpedal a little bit. Part of it is because people are already slow to adopt the console in Western markets. Another part of it is that you just increase the price of the console in Western markets that's already moving pretty slow.
So this is Nintendeen expressing how little he understands economics and Nintendo's business strategy, because they were very upfront about how they were going to continue to produce Nintendo Switch 1 games going into the Switch 1's launch, the Switch 2's launch. We saw like a lot of games getting announced that were confirmed to like, be backwards compatible with Switch 2. We were getting a lot of games that were confirmed to be coming out in 2026 that would be Switch 1 titles. Like this was a very self-evident thing. Okay, we knew the Switch 1 would continue to be supported. And what's interesting about this, the way Nintendeen tries to spin it is that he's trying to act as if the Switch 2 is failing so badly that Nintendo is going to have to like go back to the Switch 1 and like exploit that audience for cash because they're just so desperate to maintain their audience. But the simple fact of the matter is, it's more accurate to say that Nintendo always intended for the Switch 2 and the Switch 1 to coexist. Like, that's just the reality of it. Yeah, we are getting some Switch 2 exclusives, but plenty of games entered production, planning for a Switch 1 release. Like, actually, a lot of these Switch 2 exclusives were originally intended to be Switch 1 games. Donkey Kong Bonanza, Mario Kart World, Tamagotchi, ended up being a Switch 1 game. Like the idea that Nintendo would just like stop supporting the Switch 1 immediately after the Switch 2 came out, that was just wrong. And the thing about that is Nintendeen acknowledged earlier in the video that it would be silly for Nintendo to just abandon the Switch 1. So like why exactly is he trying to push this narrative that the Switch 2 is failing so badly that Nintendo is only just now going back to the Switch 1? Like, they never abandoned it. The Switch 1 has been getting constant support since the Switch 2 came out. We've gotten new releases. We've gotten, the eShop is still maintained. The online servers are still up. Like, the Switch 1 is going to coexist with Switch 2. You even see it in Nintendo Directs. They demonstrated this with Star Fox. Switch 1 game share will be compatible with Switch 2. So you will be able to play Star Fox with your buddy that has a Switch 2 on your Switch 1. Like, this console is intended to be around for a very, very long time. It has always been intended to be around for a very, very long time. And what's confusing about this is that Nintendeen seriously, genuinely believes that this is like some new thing that's coming about because of the Switch 2 failing. And that's just laughably off base and laughably stupid.
And then you compare the launch of two titles, Pokepia and Tamagotchi Life. Well, Tamagotchi Life matched Pokepia's numbers in only 2 weeks. That's a Switch 1 game. And I'm willing to wager that game is lower budget and makes more money than a Switch 2 title. And seeing as how the cost of everything has gone up, all of a sudden now, it doesn't really make sense to abandon the Switch 1 user base if you're still able to make those kind of sales. Right, like if the cost of components for selling hardware is so much, you're barely profiting off the units that you're moving as it is, then the ones that you are actually moving are in Japan where you're making even less money off of those units, Why would it make sense to focus on the Nintendo Switch 2 at that point?
So this retard is really pushing this idea that because Tamagotchi Life, one game, did really, really well on Switch 1, that means Nintendo needs to abandon Switch 2 development. They need to focus exclusively on Switch 1. They need to abandon all their plans for Switch 2 and just go back to Switch 1 because Tamagotchi did well. Like, obviously, the Switch 2 is a success. Obviously, it's in people's homes. Like, abandoning it now would be like a death sentence for them. And this is just this really speaks volumes about like Nintendeen's lack of business sense because Tamagotchi being as successful as it is, it demonstrates how successful the Switch 1 still is today. But the Switch 1 being successful is not the same thing as the Switch 2 doing poorly. In fact, I would say that the Switch 1 being so relevant still indicates just how well it's aged and how well it's still like holding its value, while the Switch 2 doing as well as it is like indicates that the format and the formula is here to stay, right? The simple fact of the matter is that these consoles are intended to coexist. And this is something that like most analysts don't seem to have picked up on. Like the Switch 1 is still going to remain very, very relevant going into the Switch 2 generation.
It's not about making Nintendo fans happy, it's about making money. So why would you care that all these people decided to adopt a Nintendo Switch 2? Because clearly there's still a very active and very healthy Switch 1 user base. And they can make you a lot more money than the Switch 2 buyers. Nearly 60% of the Tamagotchi Life buyers are still on the Switch 1. Now, an optimist would look at that from a Switch 2 lens and be like, well, that's good. They have a fraction of the user base of the Switch 1, and it got just under half of the entirety of the buyers of this game. Well, need I remind you, when Pokemon Legends ZA launched, it was the same idea. And this was also a big talking point back then. Just about half of the Pokemon Legends ZA buyers were purchased for the Nintendo Switch 2. That was huge. It was like, oh yeah, see, everybody's shifting, they're moving over. This is a very big reason why after the launch of Pokemon, the idea that they were completely shifting towards the Switch 2 became such a mainstream talking point. But if you recall, back then I made the argument, quite a bit actually, that the most enthusiastic of Nintendo fans are usually the ones that will jump into the Switch 2 initially. So they're also the ones that will buy these games at launch, and as time goes on, you'll see the ratio favor the Switch 1 a lot more than the Switch 2. And now when you're comparing the two titles, you're looking at 8.85 million units for the Switch 1 and only 3.94 million for the Switch 2. Tamagotchi Life is going to have the same patterns. If right now it's only 40% Nintendo Switch 2, that number's gonna go down a lot more as time goes on, and more of the casuals who aren't day one buyers, because they're not the early adopters of the Switch 2, those people are gonna be picking up that game. And I'd wager, if Nintendo had actually shared the data about Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, you would see similar patterns of the Switch 1 largely favoring the Switch 2, even though at launch it was probably closer. Just think of it this way from a business standpoint. Pokemon Pokepia, right? This game is pretty bare bones. I don't really think it required the hardware of the Switch 2 to launch. I don't even think it required the hardware of the Switch 1 to launch.
Nintendeen demonstrating once again that he has no idea what he's talking about. If Pokemon Pokepia could have launched on Switch 1, they would have released it on Switch 1, like they did with Pokemon Legends ZA. In fact, I believe they actually did an interview about this and said that, like, yeah, it couldn't run on Switch 1, right? And even if it could, like, it didn't. So your entire supposition just kind of falls apart. Like,
quite frankly, you managed 4 million on the Switch 2. Imagine how much you would have managed if that game was on the Switch 1. I promise you, that question is being asked in the boardroom. It's being asked by somebody.
Pokemon Pokepia will be an evergreen title, so it's not really going to stop selling on Switch 2 ever. So this idea that, like, oh man, maybe we could have gotten a handful of sales if we had just put it on Switch 1 to begin with, like, that's not really a question that's being asked, because this thing is selling consoles. It's obviously a system seller. It's this huge success, and it will always be a huge success. It will be an evergreen title for the console. So why exactly are you bringing up this idea that, like, well, like, maybe the board will wonder if they could have sold more on Switch 1? Like, it's it was decided to make this a Switch 2 exclusive, and it has launched as a Switch 2 exclusive. right? I would be very surprised if like any further consideration is given to this.
Someone in there is like, hang on a second, you're telling me this is the best-selling game on the Nintendo Switch 2, it wasn't a very hardware-heavy game. Who the heck decided this had to be a console exclusive like some of the other games? And not just that, you're seeing some of the worst launches for games and franchises that were doing amazing numbers on the Switch 1, like Mario Tennis Fever for example.
Mario Tennis Fever has actually been doing very, 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 very well on Switch 2. I don't understand this narrative of Nintendeen and from Nintendeen and people like him that like it somehow bombed or is a failure. Like that game did has been consistently on the bestsellers page on the eShop. You know, it's outselling games like Pragmata or like Resident Evil Requiem, Monster Hunter Stories 3. Like there have been a lot of games that have come out this year that Mario Tennis has outperformed. So like this idea that people have that this is somehow some huge disaster because it didn't outsell Mario Tennis Aces, which by the way is the single best-selling title in that spin-off series. Like it's just laughably stupid. You know, Tennis Aces is still selling today. You know, and that's something that I think a lot of people like Nintendeen don't realize is that because of digital distribution, a lot more Nintendo titles are going to be able to like never go out of print, and as a result of that, will do several thousand quarter units every quarter. And that's not a ton, that's not a lot, but you will see a lot of these numbers just slowly grow up over the years to the point where like, you know, Mario Tennis Aces and Fever are going to do like, you know, just kind of coexist and like continue to sell.
Yoshi and the Mysterious Book is coming soon. I mean, we're going to keep our eyes on that. I don't know if it's going to sell that well. It's probably not going to do as well as the Switch 1 version did. And those same conversations might come up again. Be like, why did we just decide to have this on the Switch 2? If we could have had it on the Switch 1 and it would have sold a little bit better for a slightly lower resolution? I mean, Nintendo fans already showed that they don't care if something's at 30 frames per second. You might as well put that stuff on the Switch 1. These are very real conversations and very real discussions that are going to be had. And they actually were had. It's evident by the discussions that were made during the quarterly meeting, when one of the investors asked Furukawa about the sales of Mario Kart World, and they seem to have slowed down since shipments of the hardware bundle concluded in December. What is your assessment of the reason behind this? In addition, what is the background behind the 60 million units of Switch 2 software projected for this fiscal year? Furukawa basically says, I don't really ask about specific games. Mario Kart World's evergreen. We don't gotta worry about that. It's gonna sell well throughout this life cycle of the Switch 2. Obviously it is. It's Mario Kart at the end of the day. It's French fries. But he specifically answers, I believe it's important that we consider how to expand the entire software business, including titles for both Nintendo Switch and Nintendo Switch 2, instead of focusing only on sales of Nintendo Switch 2 software.
So this is what I don't get about Nintendeen, and maybe you pick this up on this by watching this video, but it starts off with like glazing the Switch 1, you know, talking about how many units it's moving and how successful it is and how it's still relevant. And then he flips and starts being outraged when Nintendo president like Shintaro Furukawa comes out and acknowledges the same thing. Okay, like he's indignant. Like, how dare they not be supporting Nintendo Switch 2? How dare they not be making all these games exclusives? But like, you just said that they should have put Pokemon Pokepia on Switch 1. Like, what is it? Like, what do you want to see? This is a good example, I think, of how Nintendeen fundamentally is unpleasable. Like, this is someone who is like advocating for contradictory things, who is like, you know, making all these crazy claims and all these crazy requests, and like, it's just not doable. Like he simultaneously wants Pokemon Pokepia to be on Switch 1 while having Nintendo exclusively focusing on like Nintendo Switch 2 development. That's not how that works. That's two different things.
Oh, that's a pivot, man. That is such a pivot. Right back to where they started. The results of unit software sales last fiscal year included software that was bundled with hardware and other products, while the sales of unit forecast for this fiscal year does not include bundled software. So, remember how software units already were pretty slow in the last year for the Switch 2? And all these games are not really doing as well as they should be doing? like a quarter of all of those poor software sales are one game, and it's the one that's bundled with the console when you buy it. And if you remember, through a very relevant portion of the first 3 months of the console's life, when more people were buying in, the base model was sold out and only the bundle was available. So people were buying Mario Kart whether you liked it or not. And I realize that most people will rebuttal that and say, well, if Mario Kart wasn't bundled, they still would have bought the Switch 2 and probably bought a Switch 2 game with it, so it would have been a sale anyway. Except, not really, because so many people out there just upgraded to the Switch 2 to play their Switch 1 games, and that's actually one of the biggest talking points in the first place.
Talk about an insane cope. So what this guy is trying to argue is that people weren't buying a Switch 2 for Mario Kart World, again, that sold like 15 million units, by the way. People were not buying a Switch 2 for new video games. They were buying it to play better versions of Switch 1 games. Is that they already had? Do I get that right? Am I understanding that correctly? Like, is that what he's saying here? Because that's absolutely retarded. That makes no sense at all. Nobody was doing that. Absolutely no one. I've used like Switch 1 games on my Switch 2. You know, I've played a lot of Switch 1 games. I own several. But like I didn't buy the console for that. Okay? Cuz I could play those games already. Like the simple fact of the matter is, it was the new video games that were driving people towards the new Nintendo console.
So if you're having people that effectively decided to go for the Pro console route and they bought their Switch 2/Switch Pro, and your Switch 2 software is not selling as well as it should until it's either A, bundled with the console, or B, has the word Pokemon next to it, then obviously you gotta do some kind of pivot. You gotta make some kind of decision. You have to find a way to make more money. And just think about it logically. It's easier to make games for the Switch 1. It's cheaper to make games for the Switch 1. The Switch 1 user base includes the Switch 2 user base. After these last 6 months with the Switch 2, both between the lack of interest in the Western markets as well as the increasing price of components and all the other market conditions that have screwed them over, if I was like half certain a year ago that the Switch 2 was basically nothing more than a Switch Pro generation, now I'm at like 65 to 70% that this thing is just going to be a Switch Pro generation. I really hope Switch 2 buyers have enjoyed the lineup that they've gotten over the last year and the next 2 or 3 games that you're about to get. Because dude, if this continues, it's gonna get slow. There's gonna be a lot more Switch 1 games to play. And I mean, go ahead if you want to play that on your Switch 2 by all means. But remember, you don't need a Switch 2 to play those games. You're just playing last-gen games. And in many cases, you're actually paying more for them because you get those upgrade packs with it. Or you gotta pay the extra $10. This is going to be a really fun generation because this is yet another thing that Nintendo's going to do, which is the exact same way that Sony did it last time. And all of the smack talk that the entirety of the Nintendo fandom made towards Sony is going to come back to bite them. And actually, even then, they're not going to be offended by it because they're going to be like, well, Sony did it first, who cares? Yeah, you know what Sony also did first? They did the $70 games first, but the difference was that when it came to the Nintendo circles, for the first time in an entire frickin' generation, Nintendo games, every single one of them, has been put on clearance in all of the major retailers. Just because Sony can get away with certain things, it does not mean Nintendo can get away with them. Personally, I think it's because Nintendo fans have done a better job fighting back against different business practices that Nintendo does than Sony fans have. But I also don't know if Sony fans care as much, because they seem to think that the bang for the buck of everything that they're spending, for the most part, has been worth it. At least the majority of them do. The console has a user base of like 100 million people after all. And a whole load of them just ended up spending more than $700 or $800 on their Pro console recently too. But that's the thing though, historically Nintendo has never behaved the way that Sony does, and that's a very big reason why they've appealed so much to Nintendo fans like myself and so many others around me who have been very disappointed with the console ever since last year. And now really the only thing this thing has going for it is they keep pushing third-party games and talking about how they have nice graphics, even though the frame rates are low as heck. Or worse, they're unstable. Look, it took like 5 years-ish, I'd say, just give or take, for the PlayStation 5 generation to actually kick off, I think. Maybe 4 years, give or take. And I mean, considering the first 2 years of that were going through a pandemic and there were stock shortages, you might even be able to forgive a couple years for that. But if it took the PS5 5 years for people to finally be like, oh yeah, I finally feel like this generation is starting, and that's why people are freaking out about stuff about the PS6, because they're like, yo, we just started this generation. If it took 5 years for Sony, I am so intrigued to see how long it takes for Nintendo to completely shift over to the Switch 2.
I gotta love the misrepresentation he has here because The issue with PlayStation 5 was that they weren't getting new exclusive games at all. Like pretty much everything was a cross-gen title that was also on PS4. Because Mario Kart World and other Switch 2 exclusive games exist, the Switch 2 already has a better console exclusive library than PlayStation ever will in its entire history. And that's kind of an objective fact, okay? Like Nintendo, this is what we call a concern troll. This is what we call like a misrepresentation. Okay, like he's taking something that people had an issue with and trying to apply it to Nintendo, even though they've at their core have done nothing like that. Like the fact that Switch One continues to get new games is not the same thing as Sony not being able to let go of the PlayStation 4. Okay, the Switch 1 is going to coexist with the Switch 2 in a way that like no PlayStation console ever has before.
Because I got a feeling it's going to be a very long time. They stretched the ever-living hell out of the Switch 1's life already to make it as long as humanly possible prior to moving on to the Nintendo Switch 2. And the main reason they even brought out that Switch 2 as strong as it was is so third parties can develop games for there. People wanted a Switch 2 back in like 2021. It wasn't launched until 4 years later. And now after they launched it, they're struggling to make money off of it. And they're seeing the OG Switch make even more money now. They're about to start selling the thing in India right now. They're about to get a giant market of 1.4 billion potential buyers. And they're seeing that still, that fandom, that fan base, those people that own the Switch 1, they are more than satisfied to buy games for that console. I would not be surprised in the slightest if the way that this console generation pans out for Nintendo, it's gonna be like, major third-party games will be on the Switch 2, and a vast majority of first-party titles end up being Switch 1 games that are also playable on the Switch 2 with maybe a little bit of a performance bump. I don't know how many games Nintendo has already completed and put on the shelf and just waited for a launch date for the Switch 2, but if they're burning through those already, there's a very likely chance we're about to see a whole load of Switch 1 games coming soon. And they are going to continue to milk that console until it's so completely dry. And based off of some of the trends of the most recent titles that launched on the Switch 1, I think it's gonna take a very long time for that to happen. In any case, that's all I got for this lovely Friday. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you on the next one. Also, just a
So yeah, this entire video was just Nintendeen coping and seething about the continued success of Switch 1 and trying to gaslight people into thinking this would somehow be a bad thing for Switch 2. Hey genius. Hey genius. If you're buying games on Switch 1, you're eventually going to move on to Switch 2. You know, it's almost like Nintendo makes money off of Switch 1 or something. Like any revenue for stream for them is a good thing. Like, I'm so sick of people acting as if the Switch 1 is holding them back and that they're wasting their time with it or that, like, it's getting in the way of new games because that's very obviously not true at all. And it never has been. Like, you know, the NES was getting new games until like 1994. You know, Star Tropics 2 like was an in-house project. You know, like you see how like the concept of console gens, the idea of abandoning old hardware and moving immediately on to new ones. Like that really was a thing that was brought about because of like the console arms race. Okay, if it wasn't for people freaking out about graphics all the time, like we would have seen a lot more of this stuff in the 90s and the 2000s. Like the reason Star Fox 2 was canceled was because of its primitive art style, it would have looked really really outdated next to like the PlayStation titles that were coming out at the time. Okay? Like um that's the reality of what we're seeing. Okay, that's the reality of like this industry now is that like graphics aren't the end all be all that they used to be. And I think this is like an industry trend that people haven't really caught on to yet. Because graphics have kind of hit their ceiling because they can't get any more realistic and because people have more of an appreciation for like different art styles. What we're seeing now is that like there isn't any real reason to upgrade your console. You know, outside of like just more technically demanding games. And because these games take so long to develop, like consoles by their nature are going to have longer and longer life cycles. Okay, the Switch 1 is going to be sold on store shelves for a very, 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 very long time. And that means that, like, games will continue to be sold for it. Like it's going to stay very, very, very relevant, like long past, I think, what most people expect. And what that means is that the Switch 1 will coexist with the Switch 2. It won't compete with it. It won't take away like the user base. It won't like create a stagnant player base. Like people will pick up a Switch 2 the instant that they see an exclusive game that you can only play on that. Okay, even now, I'm sure there are plenty of Switch 1 players who are like anxious to pick up a Switch 2. It just hasn't happened yet for whatever reason. Like whether they just don't want to spend the money, or that they're waiting for the big new game that they want. Like the simple fact of the matter is, like anybody who plays on Switch 1 is going to someday be an owner of a Switch 2. And there's just no getting around it. Is that this system is here to stay, and this system will continue to be successful for years to come. I'm Harman Smith. Thank you for watching.